Hi, I'm going to show you how to do this today. Got it? Let's go. Heaven Burns Red is now one of my ongoing gacha games. I've been pretty invested into the story, and after playing it without missing a login yet, I want to do a deep dive into what late game builds look like, including breaking down exactly how the damage formula and stats work, which dungeons and resources to prioritize in what order, and a live demonstration of what the general pace of gameplay looks like in the late game. First, this video assumes that you've watched the previous two beginner guides, as I will be using certain terms and phrases that I expect you to understand, and that you've already finished or are nearly finishing chapter 3 of the story. This is a semi-long guide, so feel free to use the timestamps to navigate around. My name is Psyche, and today I will show you how to make your heaven burn redder. Yeah, let's go with that. First order of business, let's understand how damage is dealt in this game. There are many avenues in which your damage can be increased. In fact, here is a screenshot of the full damage formula as explained in the Tojo files, which is an amazing guide made by Bakasa on Discord, a long-term JP player. It literally has every tutorial you can think of, including an updated tier list and a breakdown of future banners. It will be linked in the description. But let's take a closer look at the formula. All the original data mine information comes from an actual JP player. How do they get access to all this? I have no idea. As you might expect from most other games, damage sources are multiplicative, but not all of them. I'll start by breaking down each buff type and how they factor into the final output. Skill power-ups are the most common buff types. You'll find this on most A-rank buffers and supports. It increases your skill damage. That's it. There are also variants of the skill damage up, like elemental-specific ones. A reminder that the same buff can only apply twice at a time, but if there is a separate variant of the same buff type, then you can stack that on top, like a 2x skill damage and a 2x fire skill up combo. There is also the charge up buff that some buffers can apply. Charge is also a skill enhancement that attaches a 20% crit chance on top. However, since it's in the same category or row in the damage formula, it's additive to other skill enhancements, not multiplicative, even though it has a unique icon. Not only that, charge-ups can only be granted once at a time, unlike the vast majority of the other buffs or debuffs, making it one of the weakest buff types in the game. That obviously doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, since if you have nothing better, it's at least something. Next up is defense down debuffs. Very straightforward. It lowers the defense of enemies, making them take more damage. Just like skill enhances, defense downs can also have elemental-specific variants, but this is additive to other defense downs. Field effects grant a damage boost when dealing a specific type or element of damage and are generated by certain Memoria skills. They don't have their dedicated buff indicator, but there are enough visual cues to let you know that one is applied. This buff is applied to the whole battlefield as opposed to character specific. They don't expire unless otherwise stated on the skill description, but casting a new one will overwrite the old one. Just be warned, elemental fields also apply to the enemy. If the enemy also deals elemental damage matching the field you applied, then damage will also be amplified for them. Totems are generated by certain Memorias. They are displayed as a group of dots on the UI here. Each totem accounts for a 16% damage increase for a maximum of 10 tokens or 160% additional damage. Totems are retained as long as you're in the same level, so in a boss fight you'll always have to start from scratch. But going into a dungeon, generated totems will still be present even after each encounter, since the entire dungeon itself counts as one level. Multi-hit is a rare but powerful buff type that grants more hits to your attack, with each instance of extra hits scaling off a percentage of the overall attack power. A heads up is that on the global server, there is no buff indicator for multi-hit yet, but will be added later. You can still tell that the buff is active when you see these floating orbs around the character though. Critical hits. No need to explain this. Crit rate caps out at 100%, and crit damage can be increased through other certain skills. If you don't have any additional crit damage buffs but dealt a crit anyways, then the default damage multiplier is 150%. Weaknesses. Your damage is amplified or reduced based on hitting enemy weaknesses or resistances. Some enemies may have more than one weakness. If you're hitting multiple, then they are also multiplicative. The last modifier of note is vulnerable. This is a specific debuff inflicted on enemies that increases your weakness damage. So if they're weak to slash damage, then you will deal more damage with slash attacks. However, if the enemy doesn't have weakness or you're not hitting any, then this debuff does nothing. So in the HTA farming stage, where the Animasphere doesn't have any weaknesses at all, this debuff is useless. I also want to point out a variant of this debuff called Tactical Vision. This is granted by certain Memoria skills, and it does the exact same thing, except it's in the form of a buff given to allies rather than a debuff on the enemy. However, Tactical Vision damage is multiplicative with vulnerable debuffs, so it's still worthwhile to consider if you're able to get your hands on it. Of course, if you're hitting HP damage, the devastation rate is also an additional modifier. Since I've already explained how DR works in the last guide video, there's no need for me to go over it again. Let's review the damage formula and come up with some major takeaways. Due to how different categories of buffs and debuffs multiply into each other, this means you should try to have as many categories of these multipliers in a team. For example, if we're fighting a boss weak to electric, it's a better combination to inflict a defense down plus vulnerable debuff rather than a defense down and a thunder defense down combo. As you can see, since defense down and vulnerable belong in different categories, they are multiplicative, whereas defense down variants are additive instead. I will explain how meta teams are formed near the end of the video, but this is the gist of how damage is calculated in HBR. At this point, you should be getting access to the highest tier of boosters and accessories available. So how do we optimize builds for the different roles? To do that, we'll first understand how the stats work exactly. In my last guide video, I did a brief rundown of the stats. This is more or less how the game explains them, and while this is technically true, it's not the whole truth. All skills in HBR will scale its potency off one or more stats. When built correctly, this can mean a skill doing more damage, a buff giving higher boosts, a stun having a higher chance to proc, a heal healing for more, and you get the idea. We'll start by going into one of the best community sources that all players should be aware of. This is hbr.quest, or known as the Seraph database. This is a site that contains data mine information and is used by players of all servers, even JP. You can select the memoria you wish to view, and you will be able to see all the internal info on how they work. You can switch the language and region you play on. There is an English version that only shows content released globally, but if you switch the site to JP, it will even show unreleased memorias not yet in EN yet. We'll start with a simple one. Here is Tama's first S-rank memoria's healing skill resupply. We can see that the skill has a potency range that purely scales off intelligence, with a parameter cap of 216. This means that in order to get the max efficiency from the skill, then Tama's intelligence needs to be at 216. Luckily, this is very easy to achieve. In fact, if you roll intelligence on any of the accessory slots, we'd be overcapped. If your stat exceeds the parameter cap, then the excess is effectively useless. Knowing this, we can now safely switch the intelligence booster to something that boosts defense instead. Now we'll raise the complexity a little bit. Here's Karen's A-rank Memoria's damage skill. We can first make out that it's a 4-hit single target attack skill, scaling off its potency on 1 times strength and 1 times dexterity, with an effect parameter cap of 120. Just ignore this part about the enemy border for now. We'll only focus on one thing at a time. This means that Karen's skill will scale off the average of whatever your strength stat is, multiplied by 1, then dexterity multiplied by 1. For example, let's pretend that these are my Karen's stats. We can see that she will have a strength stat of 289 and a dexterity stat of 221. We'll add them up, divided by 2, and we get 255, which is way over the effect parameter cap of 120. So doesn't this mean that Karen would always do max damage with this skill? Well, this is where it gets complicated. I'll now explain what the enemy border refers to. All the enemies in the game have their own stats too. This is referred to as the enemy border. Let's take a look at the first ever score attack added to the EN server, the Death Slug at level 50 difficulty. We can see that it has a border of 150. This means that all of its stats, strength, dexterity, vitality, spirit, intelligence, and luck are all set at 150. This is the same across any enemy in the game. All their stats are statically set to whatever their border is. Let's go back to Karen's skill. In the description, it displays that the final skill potency is 120 plus the enemy border. This means that in order for this skill to deal the maximum amount of damage, Karen's skill potency needs to be at least 120 above whatever the enemy border is. In this case, that value is 270. So Karen's 255 potency is able to do a modest amount of damage. But since she is a blaster and not a dedicated damage dealer, What if we were to change the rules a little bit? Let's take a look at the attacker class Bon Ivar's A-rank Memoria skill, for example. We can see that this skill scales off 2 times strength and 1 times dexterity. Using the exact same stats we had before, we will multiply 289 by 2, then add 221. Divided by 3, we get a final value of 266.33. While it's still just shy of the 270 max damage mark, you can see that even with the exact same stats, Bon Ivar has a higher skill potency than Karin. If we take a look at Yuki's A-rank Memoria, who is a breaker, we can see that in this case, the skill scales off 2 times dexterity instead. This is the reason why the game explains to build strength for attackers and dexterity for breakers, since you get double the potency from allocating stats to it. Here's an important note: if you deal a critical hit, then 50 points can be ignored from the enemy border. So if Death Slug's border is 150, then you can reduce that down to just 100. This now means that you would only have to get 220 potency from the skill in order to deal maximum damage. Suddenly, Karin's 255 and Bon Ivar's 266 look a lot more appealing. The TLDR is that dealing crits in this game is kind of a big deal, and it's also the reason why crit buffers are highly sought after. Knowing how the enemy border works, does that mean all attackers and breakers should be built the same way? Well, no, not necessarily. Here is Miko's first SS Memoria variant. If we take a look at her EX skill, we see something interesting. The skill potency scales off intelligence instead. So even as a damage-dealing skill, strength and dexterity are irrelevant. Intelligence is instead the stat she will want. Now, most of this data mine information is not in the game, but if there's a skill that scales off a weird stat, the game will tell you that at least. Alright, so we've taken a look at recovery and attack skills. Now we'll move on to something more advanced: debuffs. Here is the Seraph database description for Mia's A-rank Memoria skill. Contrary to before, this skill has 2 portions to it: an initial attack that scales off 1 times strength and dex, and the vulnerable debuff scaling off 1 times intelligence and 2 times luck. Okay, so how will we build Mia in the late game? What stats are we looking for? First, to get something out of the way. Unless you're specifically using a debuffer as also the main DPS, this first portion of the skill doesn't matter at all. Mia can do as little as 1 damage for all I care. She is meant to debuff the enemy and that's it. But if we only focus on the second portion, does that mean we should dump everything into luck so that we maximize the skill potency? The answer to that is, surprisingly, no, unless you're a whale. Luck by far is the hardest stat in the game to obtain. There is a necklace that grants 48 luck, but other than your boosters or accessory slots landing on the stat, it's actually pretty difficult to come by. That being said, even if you go through the grueling process of landing every luck slot there is, if the Memoria has a little or no limit break levels, then you will only be barely touching the enemy border. When we talk about the meta, we're really talking about late game bosses like those high difficulty score attacks. Those enemies can have borders as high as the 300 to 400 mark. Unless you have like 2 limit break levels on the debuffer, it's an extremely tall order to try and build luck and have it within effective skill potency. For most players, just applying the debuff is enough, because your resources are better spent elsewhere. Where exactly? Well, this is where we talk about gear prioritization. When you unlock gem battles, just please stop farming the previous flashback battles. Unless you're still severely lacking in gear, you're ready to take on the tougher bosses to start crafting 6-star accessories. There might be 1 or 2 stages that's a little awkward for you to farm because you don't have a specific damage dealer yet, and that's okay. If you can't farm a few of these gem stages, not the end of the world. You won't need every single gem type to get the late game results. Here is the priority when it comes to crafting 6-star accessories: earrings, bracelets, rings, charms, necklace, and orbs. We'll start with the first task. With any color gem and the common diamond currency, craft any of the earrings in which the resources are convenient for you to farm. It doesn't matter which of the 4 earrings you craft, but the results we're looking for is 6 different earrings that grant 1200 DP each. Gear rating ranges from +0 to +6. The rating is rolled at random, and while a +6 is incredibly rare, you don't need to get a +6 in order for a 1200 DP earring to appear. The intelligence boost is irrelevant for now. Now you might be wondering, why is this the first priority? This is because as you approach the late game, bosses will be able to hit you extremely hard. Deflector points is your lifeline. If you run out, you lose, and losing is bad. The earrings piece is one of the few ways to increase DP in bulk. If you absolutely don't want to farm this, you can settle for a 900 DP earring instead, though I would still continue to slowly chip away at it until you have a full set of 6 1200 DP earrings. Remember, gacha games are live service. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You're not expected to farm this in a single day. It took me like 2 weeks myself to get the set I wanted. If you're done with the earrings or are sitting on a stockpile of gems but no diamonds, it's time to work on bracelets. Bracelets give defensive stats, specifically vitality and spirit. Bracelets have one other trait: they will convert the wearer's normal attack to a certain element. This usually doesn't matter, but can counter certain resistances, such as how in the late game, no resistant enemies will resist attacks without any elemental affinity, making bracelets essential to building up the OD gauge. However, just a heads up that this can also screw you over. If you happen to bring a bracelet granting the element that the enemy is resistant to, then you won't be able to generate overdrive. Be sure to check what the enemy's resistances are before starting the battle. Again, it doesn't really matter which element bracelet you craft, though I would strongly recommend crafting more than one type, just so you're not screwed if the enemy resists the first element. The stats we're looking for here are 6 sets of plus 38 vitality and plus 38 spirit bracelets. If the stats are a little off, like 36 and 40, that's okay. But we need a set that will make our team tankier and less prone to being one-shotted. When you take damage, your vitality or spirit stat is compared with the enemy border. So if the enemy has a high border and your defense stats are lacking, it means you will naturally take more damage. If the difference is too large, it's possible you just straight up get one-shotted. Getting your DP bar taken out in 1 versus 2 hits is kind of a big deal, since if the bar survives at least 1 hit, then we can use a healer to recover. But if it's gone, it's a way worse situation to deal with. This is also the reason why debuffers without a high limit break level should just build defense instead of luck, since the trade-off to be within the enemy potency is too low to sacrifice defense. Sometimes you do have to let your debuffer come out to the front lines, and being able to take a hit is better than not being able to take any at all. Once in a while, you can go into the dungeons and get a couple 6-star rings. I know this is what most consider to be the weakest part of the game, since dungeons can be pretty boring. Luckily, they realized this, and the Tears dungeon is the last they ever did with this mode. Rings really only matter for your damage dealers, as they provide offensive stats. Again, there might be a dungeon or two where it's awkward to farm since you may not have a certain elemental attacker, but any dungeon is okay. In case you're wondering, the maps for these dungeons aren't random. You do have to go from the beginning every time, but as you unlock the map and teleport points, you can just instantly travel to them in subsequent runs. In case you're curious, the full maps are available in the Tojo files too. However, I don't recommend using your life points to give yourself more energy. Once you map everything out, you should be able to go from beginning to end in one go. If you run out of energy when you're only exploring for the first time, that's okay. Just exit and come back for another run. I should mention that you shouldn't go all out on these dungeons, as you don't actually need that many rings, and your dungeon passes are better used for the Oubliette of Tears, which is more endgame. So just a heads up, each dungeon run will cost 2 life points, and you can double or even triple up on the rewards. You obviously can't spend 6 life points at once, but you are allowed to use multiple dungeon passes at a time. Next up is charms. If you're wondering why I'm skipping necklace, that's because the necklace piece honestly matters less. You will unlock the charm category when your combined gear rating is 170 or higher for any squad. If all your units are equipping 6-star gear, without any memento pieces, it's actually not enough to reach 170. You have to equip some memento pieces, which can mostly be obtained from recollections or through certain events. As long as you're able to reach the 170 threshold once, charms are permanently unlocked. Once the charms tab is available, you'll unlock another boss fight at the end of the gem's flashback battles list. This is usually what you'll be farming from now on, assuming you don't have an immediate use for a specific gem. The Charms gem boss has no resistance. You must have a set of 6-star bracelets at this point to build up your overdrive gauge. And please bring a damage dealer that inflicts an element. Your free Ruka or Irene are just not going to cut it anymore. Upon victory, you'll get at least 1 purple gem per life point spent and a random gem. This means that as you get better equipped, you'll want to get diamonds from HTA instead, since you just don't have a reason to farm the other gem battles anymore. The first priority, as you might have guessed, are the Vitality and Spirit charms. You want that survivability, and this is one of the few ways to still make progress on that front. The charm stat boosts are separated into 6, 9, 12, 14, and 15. Obviously, higher gear rating is better, but since the charm can only boost one stat, having anything is better than none at all. Once you have a full set of defensive charms, you can start strength and dexterity charms for your damage dealers. After all that, you can start working on anyone scaling off intelligence or luck. Next, we have the necklace, and it does not have a gear rating, so when you craft one, what you see as its effects will remain that way forever. 6-star necklaces will grant an additional use of an elemental skill and plus 3 to a certain class's initial SP when starting a stage. The last one on the list will grant 48 luck instead of a skill use. I should note that the buff will only take effect when the wearer satisfies the condition. Luckily, most of the time, the additional skill usage doesn't matter, and you really only have to match the class of the wearer to get that plus 3 SP boost. As you can see, if you just have the 5-star variants that unconditionally give plus 3 SP at the beginning of battles, then you probably don't even need 6-star ones. The only time when the additional skill use realistically matters is during tier farming, which is something I'll explain before finishing with orbs. Tiers account for the majority of late game progression and are split by damage type and element, for a total of 8 variants. They can be farmed in the oubliette of tiers. When picking one up, one of the 8 variants will be given to you at random. Its quantity depending on how deep you go in these dungeons and how many life points you used for entry. Like I said previously, the devs learned their lesson that these dungeons are not very fun, so they've lowered the encounter rate. Plus, dungeons will become more interactive in the main story too, as they'll start incorporating the 3D environments where you can move around freely. Anyways, the Tiers dungeon has 50 floors, and while there aren't any teleporters, there is a checkpoint every 5 floors when you reach them, so you can begin another run at floors 6, 11, 16, 21, and so on. The layouts are also not random, and the Mad Lad from the Tojo files has uploaded the entirety of the maps, so you know exactly where to go. Even so, you'll often find tier farming to be quite tedious. To alleviate that, you can make a few tweaks to your team. Tier dungeon teams favor quantity over damage. The reason why the +1 skill use from the necklace is good here is that you can spam out your EX skills more times. Because each run is limited by stamina and your patience, you'll want to close out each fight ASAP, so you can roam more floors and collect more tiers. Prioritize any AoE damage dealing EX skill with many hit counts. Luca's second SS variant and Yuina's second SS variant Memorius are MVPs in this mode. This is because they have high hit count attacks in an AoE. This allows them to eat the OD gauge for breakfast and just keeps getting more SP from overdrive. Then keep spamming out their attacks, basically cutting down on the grind and making your life easier. Yuki's third SS Memoria is also a worthy mention that is to be released in the future, as her skill damage up makes her a very potent dungeon clearer. That being said, there are other damage dealers with many hit counts, and they're also listed in the Tojo files. I'll leave you to explore your route options, but you'll find that tiers, while tedious to farm, do account for a lot of your team's output. Finally, the orbs. Now, I want to make something very clear. Do not farm the orbs until you're done with everything else. There are several differences between orb battles and the other ones, but I'll just go through what the orbs are first. When you beat an orb boss for the first time, you get the orb. This is the elusive piece of gear that is the last accessory slot missing. When equipped, they will grant another skill that you can assign to that Memoria. Beating the boss again won't give you more orbs, but will grant mastery of the orb's skill. Once a character has mastered it, then they can use the orb skill without needing it equipped, meaning that you can pass it to someone else. Orb skills have very limited uses and its effect is generally very minor. While most of the orbs are quite niche, there is one major standout that's worth a farm regardless of what your account looks like. That winner goes to the Orb of Skillfulness, giving the Skillful Means ability. Costing 1 SP to use, it will grant +3 SP to the wearer, effectively a net positive by +2. Since having high SP is critically important, this makes this orb pretty valuable to have, and should be prioritized in general. However, orb skills also have their drawbacks. 1. It will take up a skill slot, so the default 3 you have may not be enough, and this is where you can start thinking about reversions. 2. It only has one use per stage. And 3, you need to actively use the skill, meaning that you can't generate overdrive with your normal attack that turn. Your roster will be kitted out slowly as you progress, so don't be too discouraged if you can't farm them yet. The difficulty is a sharp incline from previous farming modes, and the bosses have very specific weaknesses to exploit. If you absolutely want some pointers, here are a few. The boss will cast a field effect that gives them a passive damage boost at the beginning of the fight. If you cast your own field buff and override theirs, then you get a free damage reduction. Granted, most field effects aren't cheap, so you'll so likely feel the pressure in the first couple turns. The boss will drop an exclusive accessory that reduces the damage taken from them. This can actually be pretty useful as you get more of them. However, please don't roll any substats into them, as these bracelets are almost useless outside of the boss's respective fights. War battles will cost 2 life points, same as dungeons, and clearing them doesn't grant player XP, unlike the others. Don't ask me why. Luckily, player level is pretty much irrelevant in this game, but please make sure that your other upgrades are prioritized before tackling orbs. Okay, so you have a full set of 6-star accessories. How do you optimize the accessory slots? Which ones to roll and for how much? At this point, you'll likely have a stockpile of Aqua Ambers and Sunshine Drops saved up. Since we now know how damage scaling works, we can generally deduce what kind of stat each class of character would want. Here is a diagram of the major damage scaling archetypes. As you can see, attackers will want to prioritize strength, breakers want dexterity, and everything else is equal. This assumes the skill doesn't scale off a weird stat, but as you know already, if it does, the game will tell you that. For buffs and heals, they will mostly solely scale off intelligence. Just be aware that some buffs that have a higher skill potency cap, so you shouldn't be dumping all the intelligence stats onto them. Debuffs are a little bit complicated. While stat-based ones like defense downs scale off both intelligence and luck, with priority for intelligence, the same cannot be said for status afflicting ones. Effects such as stun, silence, or confusion favor luck instead, and that increases the chance to proc them at all. One of the standouts is the vulnerable debuff. While it's technically a stat-based debuff, it also favors luck. In fact, there has been no exceptions to this rule even on JP. All Memorias giving the vulnerable debuff will want luck instead. Again, as stated previously, unless you have a high limit broken unit, solely building luck is still a mostly wasted effort. In case you're wondering, since the stats given in slots can range from +1 to +3, ideally you will obviously want a +3. Higher is better, why have a 2 when you can have a 3? If you absolutely don't want to farm it though, you could settle for a +2 in the meantime. That was a mouthful. Now that you have a good roadmap of how to progress further, I'll go over some team building, discuss what makes a truly meta Memoria, and even show off an example battle. If we recall the damage formula, given that there are many avenues in which damage can be contributed, what often makes a new Memoria meta is how many roles they can fill. Since every team can only have a maximum of 6 members, being able to fill more than one role is prime real estate. While starter teams may have 2 debuffers for defense down and vulnerable respectively, wouldn't it be nice for one member to do both? Seika's second SS Memoria is considered the most meta at launch because she provides both a skill up and crit up, satisfying 2 rows on the damage calculator formula. Yingsha, aka Yunyun's first SS variant, is still the top meta pick in the EN server right now because she grants multi-hit, one of the rarest and most powerful buffs in the game. To give some examples of future meta units, we can first consult the tier list on the Tojo files, but I'll also give my own input. Mua's first SS variant power creeps Tama as the best healer in the game, as she can overheal and provide the tactical vision buff, effectively also serving as a potent buffer. Megumi's third SS variant grants a fire defense down, a fire field, and a hefty dose of damage. This gets even more insane if you have her second SS variant, where you can access her common skill of an AoE vulnerability debuff, checking off 3 rows in the damage calculation. This is also a reason why judging Memorias in HBR is a bit more complicated versus some other gacha games, as one's viability can depend on the player having other certain Memorias. EN will be entering the fire meta in the first half of 2025, as a lot of supports like Yotsuha will allow fire DPSs to become extremely powerful. That's not to mention that when the first Angel Beats collab drops, everyone gets a free copy of Yuri, who is a pretty good fire damage dealer. To end off the guide, I will be demonstrating a late game battle using the new mode Anachronies. Anachrony is essentially a ramped up difficulty from the story fights. These are active for a weekend of 3 days. JP has changed it so that you get a ticket every round so you can wait until you want to spend all of them. But in EN, you have to do the bosses in the weekend that is assigned for now. You technically don't have to do this, as the only reward you get is a Nordstrom crystal, but as you know, 3 of them can be used to introject an EX skill from a character's first SS Memoria, making them pretty desirable. The first Anachrony is the Death Slug from Chapter 1. In this mode, you're allowed to use 2 different teams, but you can't use the same character more than once. You also don't have to use 2 teams, but I mean the option is there, so I'm gonna use it. I also don't champion myself as a free-to-play, I pulled for these medic units, so I'm gonna use them too. We'll skip the first round of the trash mobs, these are just whatever, it's probably good it's here to let you build up the OD gauge. Anyways, Death Slug has 2 phases, and I plan to knock out 1 with each team. In a late game high difficulty battle, I like to split the game plan into 4 steps. The survival phase, the break phase, the blast phase, and the finishing phase. In the survival phase, just survive while building up the OD gauge, pre-buffing your damage dealer, and healing when necessary. No need to go all out on the most craziest skills. As you can see, Minori isn't the best for this job as her attack is AoE, but I figured this isn't the hardest step of the fight, I can just do it with whatever. Once the buffs are set, I start the break phase, applying 2 rounds of defense down on the slug while entering overdrive. Since it doesn't have any weaknesses, there's no need for vulnerable debuffers. Mua's tactical vision buff is pretty useless too, but I wanted a healer on the team. Minori's attack breaks but does not one-shot, and that's okay. Since this phase of the Death Slug only has 300% devastation rate cap, there's no need for a blaster. Instead, we can just do the same thing again. By conserving SP and pre-buffing my damage dealer, I go in again with the last of my buffs and finish the first phase of the slug. Second phase starts, and this part is a lot more terrifying. If you look at the internal info, the slug now has 1.8 million HP. That's a bit of a tall order for this team with most of its skills all exhausted, so it's time to bring in the replacement. By pressing this button here, you can swap to your second team while retaining the current OD gauge. Just be warned, once you switch, you can't go back to the first team. The same order of business, I simply survive while stalling the enemy attacks. Since I know this boss has a devastation rate cap of 999%, I'll want to bank up my blaster's SP too. After I reach the second overdrive level, I go into the break phase. Applying 2 defense downs, the boss breaks but now reveals its hideously large DR cap. My goal now is to buff up my damage dealer again while having my blaster Nina do 3 rounds of blasting. This entire process builds up the OD gauge again, and the boss at this point has around 700% DR. Good enough. Apply 2 more rounds of defense down, do some light attacks before Bon Iver here, and finally finishing the battle while dealing a casual 3 million damage. Hopefully this gave you a brief insight on the flow and process when it comes to a late game battle. If anything, it can almost feel like a puzzle to be solved while working around what the boss is weak or strong towards. Just remember that if you want to be better prepared, you can look up the information on the Seraph database or via some of the Tojo file guides. That's it for this late game tutorial. I do plan on releasing the occasional HBR content every now and then, but if you want to stick around for other gacha related stuff, you know what to do. Thank you for watching, and as always, have fun out there.